Welcome to Myanmar Musings, a podcast of the Myanmar Research Centre at the Australian National University, Canberra. I'm Luke Corbin. It's December 31, 2020, and today we are talking with Dr. Hiroko Kawanami, Senior Lecturer in the Department of Politics, Philosophy and Religion at Lancaster University, UK. Hello, Coco.
Hello, everyone.
Thank you for giving up your time today on the final ever day of 2020. We got there. And congratulations on your recently published book with Bloomsbury Academic Press, The Culture of Giving in Myanmar, Buddhist Offerings, Reciprocity and Interdependence. Before we get to the sociological or the anthropological parts of your book, and that is what your book is, let's begin by outlining the events that your book is talking about. You know, people give stuff to each other all over the world, all the time. But on a typical day in Myanmar, who gives things to who and when and how? And why did you decide to write an entire book, this book, about Myanmar's culture of giving?
On a typical day, especially if you live in a provincial town like Sagaing, where I did my fieldwork, you will see that monks, both older and younger monks from local monasteries, will start to arrive probably even before sunrise to receive a daily offering of cooked rice, sometimes with fried lentils or curry or bananas and so on. And in Myanmar families, especially if it is a Buddhist family, it is a custom for usually a grandmother or maybe an unmarried aunt to take up this role of looking after the monks and offering them food every morning. So these monks are usually from the local monasteries because I think they are, according to the monastic rules, they have to walk barefoot, and usually they can walk at the most, maybe 3 miles at the most. So it would be all these monasteries in the locality will visit these regular households. And this is the first meal of the day because monks and nuns do not eat since after midday. So they haven't eaten since the previous midday. And they come and receive their food without even uttering a single word. They don't even say hello or thank you. And they don't even acknowledge, but they receive the cooked rice and curry maybe with downcast eyes and leave as soon as they have received their meal. Of course, the rice has to be cooked on the day that morning. It cannot be old rice. So it would be piping hot, boiled plain rice. That would be like a plateful will be firstly placed into the alms bowl. And then people tend to put these curries or other, sort of other types of food in these small, you can say stainless containers, so that it doesn't, spoil the rice, and put it gently on top of the rice in one begging bowl. Maybe the bananas would be put on the top of, after they put the lid on the begging bowl, they might put some fruits or sweets on top of that. So they know how not to mix everything up, although when the monks eat, they might, actually mix the curry and rice as they eat.
Would you say that the food that's given on a daily basis is kind of anonymized, or is the identity of, the person giving wrapped up in the food? I'm just imagining, monks are people too, and when they sit down to eat, do they talk about or think about whether, this curry is better than that curry because Mai made her famous chicken or whatever it may be?
Well, of course, the transaction is in a way premeditated. So not any monk can go to any household. The relationship has been established for a long time, sometimes over generations. So that means monks of this monastery will know all the regular households in the area who are willing to offer them food. So they know that, well, that house is a Muslim household, so they will not visit that household. Or they know that this household always cooks nice, chicken. So they prefer to go to that household. But the information about the locality is known to everyone. So this is something that provides the foundation for the daily, worship, daily ritual transaction between the monasteries and the households, which means that everybody knows each other, especially in a provincial town.
Yeah, so there are these kind of regular daily ritual forms of giving going on, but then there are also ones that are a little bit more sporadic, right? And these are kind of connected to social status, and they may be in the forms of cash or kind.
Yes, of course. And as you know, yesterday was the full moon of December, which means that in many monasteries and pagodas, there were these pagoda festivals, which is a kind of a regular occurring, actually, sometimes an annual event. And on those special, you can say, offering days, there are still regular donors, like the person who built the pagoda or donated, the family who donated the funds to build the pagoda, or every monastery or these, pagoda premises will have a special relationship, like a donor who comes every year to offer flowers, or candle donors, or donors who bring, special all the rice bags from the villages. This kind of a transaction is much more regular than you think. Of course, there are sporadic donations that is happening more and more in the urban centers. But as you know, the cities in Myanmar, maybe there's only one city that you can call a proper city, which is Yangon. Maybe the situation is different, but the urban centers are only like 10% of the whole population of Myanmar, which means that in many villages and in provincial towns, the regular relationship, even on these specific pagoda days that happens only once a month, sometimes once a year, there are regular donors who have maintained the relationship. And also it is as you say, an opportunity to show their social status, meaning that they are financially capable of, sustaining that relationship of being a donor, being a regular donor, rather than the amount of, such donations. The regularity is what gives them that kind of a special status in relation to the monastic community.
So, for the average non-Burmese person abroad who may not know very much about the country, one of the recurring kind of news bites that people hear is that Myanmar is one of the most generous countries in the world. It often wins on these sort of comparative lists. So, my question here is, does Myanmar win these lists because of this Buddhist Burmese ritual, recurrent alms and donation giving? And what do you think about these lists?
Yes, that is a good question, because it always, kind of wonders me. I come from Japan, which is also a Buddhist country and is a quite wealthy, comfortable country in terms of its economic status. But people are not that generous in terms of giving to a monastic community or to someone. They might be generous to their friends, but they are generous in terms of there is a reciprocal relationship. But in terms of, talking about Myanmar, I think the situation is much more not only religious, but also deeply ingrained in the culture. That in my book also, I focus on this notion of interdependence. Giving is not just because you feel good in giving, but you are aware that you are part of that kind of interdependent relationship. So sometimes you help others, but maybe you might need their help at other times. So in a way, maybe without calculating that your giving will result in some form of return, people are constantly acknowledging the fact that they are part of this, interdependent existence, you can say.
Okay, so thinking about Japan as the counterexample, and maybe perhaps recent times, since say 1962, or going back to peasant times, could this culture of interdependency have something to do with economic precarity?
Yes, you could say that. Because if you compare Myanmar to a country like Thailand, which is also majority Buddhist, and it has belongs to a similar Theravada Buddhist school, and now Thailand is one of the wealthiest countries in the ASEAN, in that part of Southeast Asia. And you will notice that the amount of giving, let's say an amount that a family gives to the monastic community, is much less in terms of proportion, because in Myanmar still people will try to give 1/4 of their income to the monastic community. And as a country becomes wealthier, like in the case of Thailand, you can see that proportion, the ratio starts to go down, that people would probably spend the money more on material things or buying a car and so on, rather than giving to the monastic community. So you will have to see whether this culture of giving in Myanmar will change in the future. But for the time being, even though, even under the COVID, I see the amount of help and support in terms of, not only in terms of cash or, food stuff, but in terms of the support, the help they try to give each other under difficult circumstances is quite prevalent and widespread in Myanmar.
Yeah, great. And now you've mentioned interdependency. Why don't we move on to talking about the book? And the way I see it, your book has kind of three central pillars. The first one is the gift and the practice of giving. Then there's the setting of Myanmar. And then there's the religious world of Buddhism. So if we begin with giving, so giving someone something, it seems pretty straightforward. It happens every day, everywhere. But actually, scholars have debated, the social relations and the function of giving in societies for a really long time. The most famous, maybe, in the 20th century, was the French writer Marcel Mauss. It's Émile Durkheim's nephew, I believe. His book, The Gift, that's the English title, it was written in French, in which he posited that gifts are never really free and involve reciprocity, influence, and like a moral burden. There's a force behind giving that binds givers and receivers together. Your book builds on Mauss, but it also notes that this classic approach can be seen as a little Eurocentric and individualist. So what did you mean by that, and how does Buddhism in Burmese society work with Mauss's or problematize Mauss's ideas, and maybe other scholars' understandings of giving?
Well, actually, firstly, I have to say that I do not refute Mauss in any way. Actually, I'm a great fan of Mauss. And this is despite the fact that Mauss has been critiqued by many anthropologists and also criticized by Buddhist textual scholars who do not see that every gift has to be loaded. They advocate that there is a free gift or a pure gift, especially when the gift is offered to a religious recipient. So, in fact, I do not agree with these Buddhist textual scholars' viewpoint, and I agree more with Mauss that every gift is loaded. So there is no free gift. And I have been debating this for some time and also trying to make my point in this book about this. This is because most, Buddhist textual scholars or some anthropologists argue that secular transactions and religious donations should be separated. There are two different things. And if it is a pure donation, especially in the case of many scholars have, argued in the context of the Indian gift giving, religious offering has to be free of any moral burden. You give to a renouncer, and you should not expect anything in return, or the renouncer or the religious recipient will not offer you anything in return for your gift. So their argument is you should not expect your offering to be reciprocated. So, now, in contrast, my argument, as I said, is in line with Mao's, because I do not see a distinction between the secular and religious transactions. And that is the whole point of this book, is that I'm trying to see the religious offering and the secular giving in one long continuum, rather than separating them into two different domains, especially in the context of Myanmar. And well, maybe the only difference is, as you said, yes, I do think Maus and other European scholars' understanding of gift transaction is too individualistic, or they focus too much on the individual as the gift giver, individual as the gift donor. But in practice, because I am an anthropologist and I come from Japan, it is not only in Myanmar that people offer or make donations as a collective. Sometimes, or maybe more often as a couple or as a family, you make donations as a collective. This is also common practice in China or in Japan, that you offer as a family unit and say, this is from this and that family, rather than as an individual. So actually, coming from these Asian country, I find this kind of individualistic interpretation of gift exchange, almost like a legal transaction, rather kind of a unique or strange in understanding the local cultural practice.
Oh, that's a really great answer. Thank you also for bringing together the religious and the secular there, and the way that you see that, in this book about giving, because I noted that you called your book Culture of Giving in Myanmar. That's a primary title. And then you mentioned Buddhism in the secondary title. So we are, in a way, talking about a partly secular world in Myanmar. As we both know, there are other religions in Myanmar present as well. For example, 6 to 8% of the population, if I remember correctly from the last census, are Christian. And Christians give Muslims things and Muslims give Buddhists things. So how does all of that work in Myanmar, for lack of a more refined question?
That's a very complex question, actually, because, of course, the culture of giving, the transactions work within a community, such as we were talking about the relationship with the monastic community in the local provincial town, that where you know each other. Now, when that kind of a transaction, you try to establish a transaction with a different ethnic group or a religious group, then the first, you can say, the entry point might be crucial, because very often what I hear is, they try to help a Muslim family, for instance, but they were refused. Their gift was refused. Now, when a gift is refused or your goodwill is refused, then there is no way of going further to establish a harmonious relationship, unless you find some kind of a way to either introduce yourself or being introduced into that group, so that you can start this relationship of giving and receiving. The boundary, how to kind of overcome that kind of a boundary would be a crucial issue. But on the other hand, if you want to talk a little bit more about this kind of a relationship across religious or ethnic groups between Christians and Buddhists, you can also go to the border regions in Myanmar, like the ethnic autonomous regions. There are many examples of Buddhist groups or Buddhist monasteries working with the local, sort of ethnic groups who are not necessarily Buddhist. They could be animists, they can be Christian, they can be anything which is not Buddhist, but they have managed to establish some kind of a relationship of coexistence, because that is simply necessary for survival in some situations. So there has to be a reason if you want to extend this kind of a relationship of giving and receiving beyond your own, affiliation or your own community. There has to be a good reason to start that kind of a, relationship.
That's really interesting, and I feel like I'm taking you away a bit from your book. We could go in such an interesting direction there. My mind goes to the army in Myanmar and their kind of secular status, but at the same time being quite an actually like parochial kind of Buddhist Burma army, but they act in some ways in a secular manner and are notorious for grabbing rather than giving. And that's a whole other interesting conversation. But I feel like I'm getting outside the scope of your book. Thank you for indulging me. Okay, so let's go back to the way that you've written this book. And so now we're talking about Buddhism, right? The second pillar of your book. You differentiate the social relations of giving in Buddhist Burmese society between three groups: the laity, so the average kind of person; monks, so male renouncers; and nuns, females. And you've researched and written a whole other book about nuns. You call nuns in Myanmar the bridge between the monks and the laity in this culture of giving. Could you expand on this statement and on, what giving means in Buddhism soteriologically, and maybe why you structured your book like this with 3 separate chapters about each of these groups?
Yes, well, now talking about the nuns, I do refer to the nuns as the bridge between the monks and laity. And in Myanmar, the majority of nuns are 8 precept observers, or maybe there might be some 10 precept observers, but they're not fully ordained bhikkhunis. So in terms of their religious status, they're not equal to the monks who are ordained, because they are not simply not ordained. And technically, these nuns in Myanmar called Tilashin occupy the same religious position as, you can say, pious lay women. So they are monastic in terms of their living, sort of a everyday mendicant lifestyle. And also in terms of their religious commitment, they are really monastic who have left the world, but they are still technically lay in terms of their secular affiliation. So they're like one foot in the secular, this worldly, and the other foot in the otherworldly. So their, you can say, identity is actually torn between the two. But rather than feeling torn, I think the nuns themselves have this perception that they're fully, incorporated into the monastic community. So they are monastic in their own perception. And also by being in between, for us, scholars from looking from the outside, technically it seems like a very difficult, ambiguous position. But for them, I think they use their in-between position very effectively and mediate between the monks and laity. Often as a ritual specialist, nuns are essential in many rituals because they're not only good chanters, but they know the ritual process. Monks may be sitting on the platform, but it is the nuns who would start the chanting, start the lay people, to involve the lay people to come into the chanting. They would really sort of enhance the ritual dialogue between the monks and the congregation. For instance, they also act as lay donors sometimes. So they would be giving to the Sangha, to the monks, as in their role as lay donors. But they are also monastic recipients. So they receive from their lay supporters. In that sense, they receive, but also they give to the monastic, to the monks. They also handle money because they only observe 8 precepts. They're not fully ordained, so they are allowed to handle money. And in many monasteries, they help the monks, or they perform that role as a treasurer or a manager, because, monks will say sometimes the lay people can, run away with well, they would say, the monks will say the nuns are the most trustworthy, pious, people in the front line. So in many ways, they use this go-between position to the advantage of keeping the monastic community together, you can say. And also because of their various knowledge, lay people, if somebody dies in the family, they want to conduct a funeral, they might not go directly to the monks because they don't know how to speak to the monks. They don't know about how to use the honorifics. They don't know when to bow. So they could go to the nuns because they're much easier to talk to and ask them how much money should they prepare for the funeral, which monastery, which monk they should invite, which is the right, when is the right day to conduct this special ceremony. All this information, usually, the nuns will part and give to the lay donors if they come to consult them. So in many ways, they are the lubricant, you can say, to make sure that all kinds of religious, functions are well performed, the rituals are well conducted smoothly. And, they are really a source of information, as well as a very good ritual practitioners, you can say.
That is a really good explanation on the role of nuns in particular in these monasteries, these Buddhist institutions. And we can say, soteriologically, that one of the reasons people give to these Buddhist institutions is to gain a better rebirth in their next life. But these gifts are also quite consequential, right, in these Buddhist institutions that can become quite large. So how are these gifts kind of accommodated and distributed? These people are being kept alive and funded in a sense by the laity. By these people, I mean, monks and these institutions. So anyway, how does all of that work?
It's going to be a difficult one to answer in a short period of time. But, let's say in every village, there is a monastery. So traditionally, if you think about, medieval Europe, it's like in every village, there was a Christian church. Similarly, in Myanmar, I would say in most villages, there will be at least 1 or 2 monasteries. And the monastery is sustained by the local, the residents of that village, or some of their children also, boys would have been ordained or become novitiated in these monasteries. So there is a close relationship. Now, you talk about these big institutions, but all the large monasteries are Buddhist seminaries. Otherwise, there's no other way of growing into these large institutions. So they're like a private universities, which have grown due to the quality of the teaching. Well, monk students and also nun-students also, they go to these monasteries or nunneries sometimes where they hear is a very good teacher. And if the teacher has a good reputation, such as, Utiloka, the chairman of Mabata, he is one of the most popular Buddhist teachers, and his textbooks are used in almost every monastery. So, people do not realize that before he became, prominent in his role as the chairman of Mabata, he was known to have produced like 3 Tripitaka, students, this very prominent degree of having memorized all the Tripitaka, sort of Pali texts. He has produced these students, and he has many non-students as well who have passed these government exams with flying colors. And one of the reasons why his monastery in Yangon is probably one of the largest is because of his popularity as a teacher. And these monasteries, large monasteries, are, as I said, without exception, these Buddhist monasteries where pariyatti, which means Buddhist scriptures, are taught. and then they train their students so that they can pass the exams, private and also government exams, and become accredited with these special degrees that are granted by the government. And eventually they become very, sort of famous monk scholars. But there are many monasteries which are not so wealthy, not so big, only supported by a small group of people, because large Buddhist seminaries are supported by many donors. Every student would bring their donor, and every donor will support their monastic teacher, and they would have several good teachers who have passed all these government exams and are, sort of a well-known throughout the country, so that again enhances the reputation, attracts more donors or more donations. So in a way, scholarship is something that attracts people's attention, and people would want to donate in Myanmar because they have much respect for the Buddhist scholarship, Buddhist learning. It is a little bit different in meditation centers or meditating monks. I think that is in a different category. Maybe I'll talk about it in another day. But Buddhist institutions, which you call institutions, like the one in Mandalay, Musoin Town, or the one in Yangon, the Insein Yuama Town, or all these institutions are where they have these thousands of monk students, and also they're totally loyal to their monk teachers. It's almost like an army in the kind of a way they organize themselves, and in the lineage, in the alumni network.
Yeah, sensational. I hadn't really thought so clearly about the differences between large and small monasteries, and then the way that they kind of need to upgrade to seminaries at a certain point. I guess I was also trying to ask about the kind of distribution of gifts within the monastery or seminary.
Of course, every individual monk or sometimes nun will have their own donors. That means the donor will come to a monk or a nun if he or she finds this recipient to be worthy. And the way Myanmar people will, sort of decide whom to donate. Of course, some might say, well, this nun or monk has come from the same village, so there might be that kind of local connection, or sometimes, kin connection, but that is more rare. They have to decide according to what they see is worthy of giving. And that criteria is often based on Buddhist scholarship in Myanmar. So in that sense, you can say the more prominent you are as a Buddhist scholar, and because the government exams, private exams are one criteria, which is officially announced, like the student who took the best mark, who stood first, who came out with distinction. All of these names are published in the newspaper, in the TV, in the social media. And by getting that information, people will congregate, or they would all come to that monastery or to that monk whom they would like to donate. So, the nunnery school I have started in Sagaing has been very successful simply because the nuns have done very well in their scriptural studies. And this year also, 3 nuns from this nunnery school called Sachadita Telashin, Satendai, and Sagaing, 3 have stood first in the government exams at all different kind of a degree schemes. And that has really enhanced the donation income almost like tenfold. So this is how people decide in Myanmar.
That's amazing. Good for them. Okay, but coming to what I characterized as the third pillar, which is about the Myanmar context. So how do these social relations of giving in Buddhist society affect, or are they affected by Myanmar's changing, political society? As we both know, there's been a lot of changes in the last 10 years in Myanmar, and then, of course, many changes before then. Maybe a good way to ask this question is as a comparative as well. we have, quite comparable or devout Theravada Buddhist societies in Sri Lanka, for example, which you talk about a little bit when you discuss other scholars' work. And then we've already mentioned Thailand. So how does the Myanmar angle come into this?
Well, I am not sure if I've understood your term, Myanmar's changing political society. But if I am to compare the social relations in rural villages or provincial towns, which I have already talked about, this is the kind of environment where people know each other for generations. And the local reputation as good Buddhist donor, for example, is still important for the local residents. And if you compare that kind of environment to Yangon, for instance, or even Mandalay, but maybe the population of Yangon and Mandalay combined together will only make 10% of the whole population of Myanmar, which means that compared to, let's say, Sri Lanka or Thailand, even, urbanization has not, even though you say Myanmar has opened up in the last decade, urbanization has not really started in Myanmar. Let's say in Sri Lanka, it would be still maybe 50-50. Or Thailand, it would be 50% rural, 50% urban. Myanmar is still a very rural, communalist country in that sense, because the urban centers are so small. So if you're talking about the political society, changing political society, maybe you're thinking about Yangon, where people are much more mobile and disconnected to their traditional communities. And if you're going to talk about that kind of an environment, emerging political society, obviously the social relations of giving are markedly different in cities. And people's manner of transactions, or the way they choose their recipients, monastic recipients, or the way they, conduct social giving, like many celebrities, since the Nargis have started to be more giving to these victims of natural disasters and so on. It may be quite similar. People in Yangon may give in a similar way to people in other cities in other parts of the world. But another thing I have to point out is maybe in Myanmar, there are about 500,000 vocational monks, which is the same number as the number of soldiers in the Myanmar army, and 60,000 Buddhist nuns, very large number. And you can say that, well, I would say that maybe more than 90% of the monastic community are from these rural agricultural communities, or some from provincial towns, but very few from Yangon or from Mandalay. They come from the soldiers, and the monks and nuns come from the same kind of a rural congregation. So in a way, you might talk about the changing political society, but I have been going to Myanmar every year, and I don't see much change in the majority of these rural villages or in these provincial towns, although some might have gone abroad to work in South Korea or in Malaysia. There might be these people going abroad, but there is a very different environment which has not changed, despite some, changes in the urban infrastructure development in Yangon or Mandalay. The cyclone Nagi struck Myanmar in 2008, right? And that really flooded the Irrawaddy Delta region, and it really affected probably like 3 million people. And at that time, I remember that humanitarian aid and donations from overseas really flooded in. And there was the disaster really increased people's interest in the country. But I do go to that Irrawaddy Delta region quite often these days. But one thing I have to say that although soon after the Nagis, there was so much interest, But when I visit this area today, or in the last few years, I've never come across anyone. I have never met a single NGO worker, let alone a foreign tourist. I've never met anyone coming from outside of Myanmar or outside that region who are interested in that kind of an area that was once, become completely flooded, and many villages were completely devastated. And that is something I always find strange, that people congregate in some areas, or they're interested in the ethnic minority regions or Arakan and, the Rakhine state and so on. But there are so many areas in Myanmar that, I have been going quite frequently. I never meet anyone from the outside, or a foreigner, or a foreign looking face. And I wonder, why is that? Somehow, even the media reporters I've never come across. So wondered, why is that happening? So I think there's a disconnect in terms of what is reported in the international media, because most NGO workers, even though they might be Myanmar people or media people, they don't live in the rural communities. They are based in Yangon, or some might be in Mandalay. So I always feel that there is something missing in this kind of reportage, that they don't really talk about what kind of a relationship, transactions that take place in the everyday life of people in these areas, vast areas outside the small pocket in Yangon.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a really good answer. You've compellingly put how you see the main cleavage being to do with urban and rural, and highlighting that although Myanmar is urbanizing quickly, that the urban is still in the minority. I didn't mean to imply using that term opening up. I was just talking about changes in ideas of what's sort of legitimate. And now that there is this ostensibly legitimate government that is under a democratic system, suddenly you have all these concerns regarding corruption, and gifting becomes bad. People lose their jobs for receiving gifts if they're MPs, for example. And so there, seems to be something going on there. That's kind of what I was getting at. And that's tied to the whole, the Luji thing, where because the state has been bankrupt for a long time, it's been incapable of providing for citizens, and the Luji, the big people, the celebrities, are the ones that give to the people. The government's incapable of it. And we've seen that with COVID. That's what I was kind of getting at, that there's this other conceptualization of gifting in this sort of liberal democratic template that has somehow taken a hold recently in Myanmar. So that was sort of where I was going.
Can I just add something to what you've just said? This is something I hear often from many friends who are in the construction business in Myanmar, because that is booming, is that they say that during the military regime, it was very clear whom you had to give the gift to in order to get this contract. You know that this was the minister or the assistant minister. The kind of a social hierarchy was very clear. So it was much easier to, even if it was a bribe, to give a gift to someone high up in the government. But because of the democratization, they were saying that everyone expect you to give a gift because it is democratic, so that it is much more difficult now because you have to give a gift to everyone because the hierarchy has become much more blurred in the new democratic system, that people find it very difficult, or even it is more difficult now to get a contract because you have to bribe everyone in a democratic way.
Can I ask a cheeky question? You've been doing field work in Myanmar for a long time. is there any gift that has been given to you in fieldwork that is quite memorable?
Yes. And it is not from the Myanmar people, but from these Japanese war veterans. Actually, I was initially in Myanmar in the mid-1980s, and maybe many of these war veterans might have died by now, or their children might still be visiting Myanmar, but they would often, they were still going around Myanmar collecting the bones of their, comrades who have fallen during the war. And they were already old, but at that time I was a Buddhist nun myself, and they would find this Japanese Buddhist nun in the middle of nowhere. And they always used to give me a lot of donations. And I didn't know what to do, but they said, it doesn't matter because you're doing some good work, and please pray for our comrades. And they would say things like that. And I did accumulate a lot of money in the 1980s. And of course, the general norm is you offer to the monastery, or you build a pagoda, or it was, a lot of money. And I built a lot of toilets in the area. I myself have noticed that, that was a luxury to have a proper toilet. And there were public toilets, and old nuns in the middle of the night had to go to these public toilets, walking like 15 minutes to get there. It was quite difficult. And that was what I did with the money I received from these veterans.
That's a really wonderful story. I mean, that's amazing. Good on you.
And of course, the people said, why the Myanmar people didn't understand then why I would use the money in that way, because that was not normative. And they found it rather strange. But I think probably now they understand why I made these toilets.
Yeah. And you also remind me of that Japanese movie. The English title is A Burmese Harp. And
oh, yes.
Which is all about this kind of nostalgia and this connection with Theravada Buddhism in Myanmar and the Japanese presence in Myanmar. You've reminded me that I need to go and watch that again.
Yes.
Okay, so on Myanmar Musings, we always finish with our guests providing a recommendation. If you have one, it can be anything to do with Myanmar, a book or an essay or a food or a school for nuns. Do you have a recommendation for our listeners?
Well, I really would like you to visit these Buddhist monasteries. Many tourists don't even bother to go to these places because they are also the medium, you can say, for Myanmar people's donations. People offer to the monks and nuns, but often their offering would be redirected to people who are poorer or who are suffering victims. And sometimes, you offer cash to the senior monks, but it doesn't mean that they hoard them. If they have connections with the local authorities or monasteries in these faraway regions, they would redistribute the cash that is sufficient, that is a surplus. So in order to understand Myanmar society and culture, I think it is important that you visit what is the core of their religious activities and how people engage with one another, how they try to help each other. And even during the current lockdown, in the provincial town of Sagaing, where I have been based, many poor people who have lost their jobs or who have no other means of income have been congregating. They have been going to these monasteries to be fed by monks. So now they're reversing the order of giving. The monks are feeding the people. And I would really like you to see it when you visit Myanmar.
That's excellent. That's a really, really wonderful recommendation. This has been such a great chat. Thank you so much for coming on Myanmar Musings, and I hope that all of our listeners go out and seek out your book, which again is The Culture of Giving in Myanmar, Buddhist Offerings, Reciprocity and Interdependence. interdependence. So thank you, Coco.
Thank you, Luke. Thank you, everyone.